want to start real quick and try to show you the end so that you want to stay and are interested. So what I'm going to talk about are some projects I've been working on where I'm working very closely with development teams in their agile processes and things that I can do to help them achieve better results. And so kind of throughout their phases of development, there are ways that you can inject yourself in and make a difference. And this is kind of the difference that I observed. So the red bars represent kind of typical security findings. I don't know if you guys do testing, but this is, in my experience, pretty common to have at least some highs and a whole bunch of others. And to me, this is a pretty awesome result, to be able to reduce that so that when we did the full test at the end, as if we had done a waterfall project, we had a really good result. So if you want to know how we did that, that's why you should stay. Otherwise, go eat lunch. Just a little bit of background about myself. Actually, how many people in the room are developers or would classify themselves as developers first? Awesome, a lot. And that's my background too. I wrote code for probably 12 years before I even touched security. And then I worked for a security company, which made me interested in it, and I got my apps pen tested, and I realized that I really didn't know very much about security. Tried to learn, ran into a lot of the probably typical difficulties with communication and other things. And about 3 years ago, I started my own company so that I could focus on working with developers in whatever way I thought was working the best. And so that's what I'm here to talk about. That's what the name comes from. Can anybody tell me what an inception is? Any of the developers in the room know what an inception is? Not you. Go ahead.
So we're between concept and business case?
Okay. Right. Yeah. So in some software projects begin with an inception. So one of the examples I'm going to draw from is a project where we did an inception up front, where we started in a room that's, a lot of whiteboards. We did a bunch of brainstorming, use cases, try to figure out who our users are for the system, and then try to figure out what they need to do and how we're going to help them do it. So, and then we do things like, this is a prioritization activity where you have sort of top left are the most important and easiest. The value is on a scale here from right to left. The ease is up this scale, so you kind of want to usually do those things first. So it's kind of the activity that the development team is engaging in with the business present to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And then you end up theoretically with a roadmap like this. So since we have one, can we brainstorm personas for this talk? So let's say this talk is our project. And we need to think about personas. Can anybody tell me what one of the users' classes would be? What's a persona? Sorry?
Administrative system or workload application.
Okay.
Developers.
Say it again.
Developers.
Developers, okay. I was thinking even simpler than that.
Tester and user.
Tester and user, this is great. Those are all, sorry, say it again?
Operations.
Operations. So you guys are doing a great job thinking about personas. Let me tell you kind of what I was thinking. Because they're all right, I'm not saying they're wrong.
What did you want us to say then?
Here's what I wanted you to say. There's a speaker. There's an attendee. There's a, what do you call yourself? Proctor. Right, so these are like the specific user roles in this room right now. So they're the personas we have to think about, right? Does this kind of make sense? So as we're sitting in this room with with stickies all over the wall, trying to figure out what we need to do to build the right system so that the business is happy, one of the first steps is usually to identify these personas. So the first thing that I do is introduce who? There's one more persona. It's actually pretty simple to imagine, but I like to call it the villain persona. So what would a villain persona be doing in a talk? Heckling, promoting their company, right? There's all kinds of things that a villain persona could be doing. What's that? Videotaping, right? The point is, when I'm sitting there with the business and they've put their personas on the wall, you want the villain persona to be first-class persona, someone that they're thinking about, right from the very beginning. Because when you do that, you can say, well, how would this feature get misused, right? And, well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I run into this problem a lot, where the stakeholders are not saying, hey, I need you to protect me from SQL injection. Like, that's what I really need. Right? They never say that. But they do assume that you're not introducing SQL injection, right? If you introduce the villain persona, you say, well, there's going to be someone trying to abuse this form. Now I can capture what the steps are to try to produce the story that says, I'm not introducing SQL injection. Let me just talk about that. This is what that looks like in the real world. So in the case, one of the cases that I'm drawing a lot of the examples from, they did an Inception, and I spent a whole week at a client with the business and the developers. I was not a developer on the project. I was a security developer person, right? And one of the things that I did up front was go meet with the security team from the client to write down what documented requirements they already had for the system, right? So a lot of organizations have security, but they may not be able to take on AppSec in this kind of proactive way, right? But if I go do something that they don't know about, they're going to come back later and say, well, what is this anyway, right? So I wanted to know what their password requirements were, what kinds of devices they already had in place, right? I wanted to understand their security environment a little bit and then convey that back to the developers so that, you know, password requirement is documented from the beginning. It's not something that we add on later when it fails a test. At the end of this Inception, what the developers had was a bunch of stories that they needed to go implement, right? But as is typical, the client wants a lot, but they don't have infinite resources to pay for it. So they have to decide which things they're going to do and which things they're not, right? And this happens independent of security already, right? You've got estimates and ranking, and you build out your backlog so that you know how much you can do basically in a certain amount of time. Well, what we want to do is make sure that when people are estimating, they have the information they need to bake security into the story points. And if I have a story and it includes security, then everything works. Like I'm using these kinds of things as a developer, as a manager of developers, I use these things to track progress, right? I want to know that I'm making progress toward a goal. If I make progress toward a goal, and then all of a sudden I have all this new security work at the end that I didn't account for, this whole system is broken. It doesn't work for me, right? So I want to see risk already factored into story points, which story points is just, you can think of it as hours estimated per story. We don't need to go super deep on that. Does this make sense? Kind of the whole angle of this talk is like understanding where developers are coming from and trying to work within their tools so that your result is already secure, essentially. Now, I have been talking long enough in the security community to see where, when I started doing it, people were like, Agile? Agile's bad, right? It's terrible for security because it means that, you know, we don't know when anything's happening, we don't know when the releases are happening, we can't control anything. And I've been saying for a long time, and then I think other people have shown in maybe better ways how Agile can actually help from a security perspective. And so what I did here is quickly take the foundations of Agile, and I think they work almost perfectly from a security perspective, and I just want to point that out, right? So emphasize individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? It's great to have tools and process, but unless you are in it and solving problems, you don't know what's happening, right? emphasize working software over comprehensive documentation, right? It's great to have hundreds of vulns identified in my app, but it's better to have fixed 5 of them than to have a document with a ton of findings, right? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So for me, this means like I want to interact with the developers all the time and understand whether they understand what I'm asking them to do, right? It's not just, hey, I told you what to do, and you have to fit these 10 bullets or else you didn't meet the contract requirements. It's how can I help you understand the first thing in the list, because maybe that's the most important. And then Agile emphasizes responding to change over following a plan. So I like to have a plan, but everything changes, as everybody knows. The tools are all different now than they were 3 years ago. So having a plan to implement tools may or may not make sense anyway. Ultimately, just as a, again, sort of a refresher on what Agile is, right? People think that Agile is trying to get somewhere faster. It's really not about getting somewhere faster. It's about getting to the right place. So in a traditional plan, you kind of say, okay, here's where we're going to go. Maybe this is a year long, right? Agile is not saying it's going to take less than a year. Agile is saying we're going to get to the right place at the end. And so each one of these smaller arrows is like a sprint where you reevaluate, are we going the right direction? Right? And what I'm trying to show here is at some point we figured out that wasn't the right place. Same exact thing happens with security projects, I'm sure you know. Just an anecdote from a customer where we were involved talking about business requirements, and the business users were saying, hey, we have this problem where our customers share logins, right? So I have a login and somebody else uses it. They share it between locations. And they said, well, what should we do about that? I said, oh, well, 2-factor, of course. And the developer's like, oh, okay, huh. Business is like, well, what would that look like for our users? So I described pins and gave examples of systems they've already used that have 2-factor available. They said, oh, we can't do that. You know, that won't work for our users. And we said, okay, you've defined that the requirement is not 2-factor. That's a great outcome, actually. Right? I mean, we sort of are probably pre-programmed because we're in a security conference to think more is better. But you're always making trade-offs about resources. So when you say no to something, it means you're going to do something else, probably. And so 2-factor in this case was not a fit for them. I thought it was a win to say, we're not doing 2-factor. The development, the security organizations knew it. The business had said, we're not doing it, right when they thought about it. They never had to come back around and say, oh, I can't believe we didn't do this or whatever. We talked about it right up front.
What's 2-factor?
So it's where, like an example would be, I use 2-factor with email. So when I log in, I have to give my password, and then it sends me a PIN code, and I have to enter the PIN code. So because I have a phone and a phone number that they know, they feel more confident that it's me coming in. And there are different ways you can do 2-factor with certificates and other things. But the idea is it's like something you know and something you have, some other thing. Any questions about that so far? Feel free to stop me. I'm agile. Another example I want to raise is around auditing. So developers don't really think about auditing a lot. You know, we sort of write logs to get information we need to fix problems. But if you've been writing software for a long time and you've ever had a breach or a bug or a problem, you probably know that if you don't have auditing information, you can't ever tell a customer what actually happened. So as an example from my real world, I worked on a system where a customer saw other customers' data, right? Really bad bug. It was actually more of a business logic bug than a security bug in certain respects. And we fixed it immediately. And the first question that the customer asked was, well, how do I know somebody else didn't see my data? Right? And luckily we had done some auditing, and so we knew that when people were reading, we could see when people were reading records as well as writing. So this is something that we were able to specify up front. This is required for certain types of data, maybe not all types of data, right? Does that make sense? Like when somebody's looking at an account, we need to make sure we track that that's been looked at by this user at this time. And when the developers know that, they can implement that easily. In the system, they did it with an aspect in Spring, and it took them probably an hour, right? Well worth it, once they understood what was needed. So on this project, the other thing I did was, if you're familiar with Agile, you get this backlog, right? And every sprint, you decide that you're going to do N stories. Let's just say N is 5 stories, right? So going into the sprint, you don't ever want to change what's in the sprint while you're working on it. But you need to decide what you're going to do next. So typically, like a senior technical person in the business, they'll be looking at those stories before they get into the current sprint so that the developers can focus on right now what we're working on. So what I would do here was I would go look at the stories before they ever got to the developers. And on a lot of stories, there are what's called acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are, you know you fulfilled the requirement because if you put in a bad zip code or you put in a letter where there's a zip code that should be all numbers, the system validates and tells you it's not okay, or whatever, right? Acceptance criteria are usually what QA uses to say this does or does not pass the requirements of the story. Well, if I say that the acceptance criteria also include this class of users should not be able to access this data, then I've articulated a security requirement in a way that the QA and the developer resources can already understand. So by doing that translation, you can actually build in the right kinds of authorization controls up front because you've defined them. And the business sees the same story and says, yes, that's the correct requirement. An admin from, maybe you have layers of admins and they shouldn't be able to see different things. So if you do Agile, you probably know that, like, way out, you don't really try to spend a lot of time getting things to perfect estimates. For stories, you kind of ballpark, you guess, right? And as you get closer, you're refining the requirements. And so that kind of is the same thing I was just saying, where you start out here, and I haven't done security acceptance criteria for any of these stories. I don't start there. I don't try to do it for everything. It's only as they get to the point where they're about to get executed that I want to make sure they've got security baked in. And so I will do this once a week, spend half an hour looking at stories. It's actually pretty easy as long as you can kind of think about security requirements and communicating those to the developers. The other thing I did on this project, the one that had the bar chart, was incremental code review. So I found that the initial code review took a long time because they, in the first week or two, put together all their frameworks, a whole bunch of pages. There's a lot of code there, right? But then after that, subsequently, every week, it was actually pretty manageable to do code review of all the new code, manual code review of all the new code in an hour. It really didn't take that long. And so then I can say things like, so for example, these guys were using Timeleaf, which is a tag library that people use with Spring. And so depending on how you use tags, some of them will put in encoded and not encoded data, right? So if you use a tag UL, or UText, I think it is, right, it's not going to encode the data that's getting put in the page, which means that you could inject JavaScript into it or something like that, right? So as soon as I knew that that tag was a problem, I told them, first of all, and then I grepped for it every week. And every couple weeks, somebody would do it again. But eventually, they stopped doing it ever, right? And they learned that that's not okay. You can't use that tag unless you really, really know what you're doing and mean to. So it's a really simple course correction that prevented cross-site scripting pretty much throughout the whole app because they started using it pretty widely. Also do like query reviews to make sure they're using parameterized queries everywhere. That's like actually really easy to do, especially if you're only looking at 5 queries a week or 10 queries or 20 queries a week. It's not that much, right? Another thing I did is I got on HipChat with them. So I'd be sitting in their chat, and if I had a finding, I'd be like, hey, who worked on this stuff? Can we talk about it? You know, make it a conversation. Make yourself available to them. And it really, I mean, the tools are so great now that it doesn't have to be a lot of your time. You just make yourself available, ping them, they'll come back if they have a question. I'm not going to talk a lot about continuous integration. They were using continuous integration. We did not build awesome gauntlet stuff for this app, but I would next time. And I'm going to actually have a project I'm going to do that for now because I think the value is manifest. right? Then the developers get feedback as soon as they commit. So one of the things, I mean, I like tools as much as the next person, and I use tools, and I write tools, so I really like tools. But one of the things I like to emphasize is, that kind of business logic bug where maybe somebody can see someone else's data, that's not something that most tools can even find. That's a really simple example of something I challenge you to find a tool that can find that. So that's why I really believe that engaging with developers like this is really important. Another thing that we did, I talked about the acceptance criteria. I had a different customer who was using TFS. I don't know if does anybody use TFS? It's like Team Foundation Service. So one of the things we did was tweak TFS to present checklists in a separate tab for each story, or task, or maybe both, so that people had to check that they had made sure there was not SQL injection in the code associated with that story before they could commit and move that story forward. Does that make sense? So you literally have little checkboxes and they just check. And you have to be able to, it's a little bit of development to build that form in the database in the back end. But the result was that as they moved those things forward, they had it built in that there was a check. I don't know if anybody's read the checklist manifesto, but I thought that was an interesting thing. Another thing I like to do, and I do on almost all my projects, whether it's Jira or version 1 or Pivotal or Trello or whatever else the development team is using, use that. Don't make them come to you. They're all the same once you figure out what it is, right? A lot of times I'll set up a security project that looks just like their project. It has sprints, right? They can understand what I'm doing because I'm doing it in the same tool they're using. I saw that somebody tweeted, and it wasn't in the talk, so I was in another talk, but somebody, I think it was Zane Lackey this morning, said, verify the false positives yourself before you give them to the dev team. And I would totally reiterate that. It's his knowledge, but I'm going to try to re-say it, because the minute that you give people items that you don't understand, or that they don't understand, or you don't understand that they're not real, then the developers start to question whether you're really adding value, and they don't necessarily trust you as a resource as much. And so a lot of what I'm doing, and again, I'm able to do this because I'm in my own totally different world, is engaging with these dev teams and trying to get them to trust me so that when I say you have to change something, they do it. So for me to say, oh, you have cross-site scripting, and they don't, they're going to find that out. They're smart. The other thing is, I didn't really say that, but I kind of feel like we should, when we're engaging with developers, start with the assumption that they're smart. Don't start with the assumption that they're dumb. I don't know if anybody saw my Builders Breakers talk a couple years ago, but that's like a big thing for me. It bugs me. Does anybody go to, well, I guess developers probably do. Does anybody go to stand-ups? Sort of. So stand-up sounds really complicated and feels useless when you first start going a lot of times. But what happens is you get to know what's happening on a project. So with these projects, I didn't go to stand-up every day. That wasn't necessary. But I would go to stand-up every week for 10 minutes. Right? So I knew what was happening, I knew which stories were happening, and they got a chance to ask me questions in case they couldn't catch me on HipChat. In stand-up, basically what we were doing is starting with a to-do list, moving cards from doing to done, right? It's a really super simple process. Your stand-up should basically be saying, do I have any issues or roadblocks, right? But it's also an opportunity for people to tell you they don't understand something. Another thing I like to emphasize is that every development process is a little different, right? Agile isn't Agile isn't Agile isn't Waterfall isn't anything, right? They're all different. So which things will work is going to be different with different organizations. So you sort of got to figure out, is what I'm doing working? With Rails projects, for example, I find that Breakman is a great early feedback mechanism, right? So I try to use Breakman on most of my projects that are Rails-based. I like doing code review. That's something you can always do, but it takes personal time. Or you have to have an arrangement with the client where it's going to work that way, or the project team where it's going to work that way. So these are all things that kind of play into how the SDLC works that are related to security. But in my experience, you have to be flexible about which ones you're using and emphasizing. But we talked about security in the story. One thing that I didn't mention that I should have mentioned was another thing that's great about being in the inception up front is that you know how the developers are planning to build the system. Like you know what the big boxes are. And you can tell them before they start. In this case, that I'm thinking of, the development team committed to build the product in 4 months, probably 16 man months or something like that. Right? They were putting money and time estimates that the client was going to hold them to on this project. And so if we had a major change in architecture, for which could be valid for security reasons, it might have cost them a lot of time. So having that up front, where we've established that as a baseline, was important. How many people write unit tests? Less than go to stand up. I've never really seen a project that did unit tests quite to the level that I wanted, but I also don't believe that 100% test coverage is like the ideal target. So what I care about when I look at unit tests is, did you look at anything other than the happy path scenario? That's the main thing I care about. Right? A lot of times developers write a unit test that says, oh, I made a login form, you should be able to log in. And then they write the test, I can log in. Done. Well, I mean, that's sort of obviously a problem. But what the developers can't always do is figure out what they should be putting in that test. And so I don't need to write the test for them, but I can say, well, what if I retry like 100 times in a row? Is the system going to do anything about that? What if I, want to reset my password? What if I, like all these simple workflows that you can just ask about, they can then test. Preferably using Gauntlet or Cucumber or something like that. Maybe. So another thing I did at this client was work with the teams that were going to be running the software at the end, early. So they had totally separate operational teams that were running servers and databases and middleware and network and all these other things, right? So right when we started, we kicked off and said, hey, we're building this new product. It's going to go in your network somewhere. Can we talk about how it's going to look? So we had 4 to 6 months to figure out how it's going to look in our network. Now, every organization is different. Some you could roll out something new very easily. This was not necessarily. So we benefited from thinking about that early. People didn't have as many questions. Another thing we did is look at how you would know if there was a problem. So like detecting issues, monitoring. How do you know that the system's healthy? And there are relatively straightforward ways to do that if you just ask a question and find out what tools are available, right? So this, like, again, I have a project in my head that I'm thinking about, and they had Tivoli, right? So you can use that to do a lot. Don't make them buy New Relic, which is great. Let them use the tool they already have, but figure out what you can watch. Failed login attempts is an easy, super easy thing to monitor almost anywhere. Another thing is looking at the challenges, not just I have the right information and I'm going to give it to you, as much as I have a perspective that we should talk about. And I have another totally different client where the developers knew they had serious security issues, but they couldn't get the business to buy into them spending time fixing them because they couldn't articulate why the security issues mattered. So I have cross-site scripting. Well, why do we need to fix that? That doesn't seem so bad to me. It's whatever. What's the chance it's really going to happen, right? And they couldn't really, the developers weren't armed to say, this is a common issue, this is how it would manifest, here's how we fix it. And so a lot of that particular engagement was just working with both the developers and the business to communicate about security. And that's not very hard, it's just we don't stop and do it very often. And a lot of times our clients don't give us a really easy way to do it, right? One thing I've found with developers, and I don't know if you guys have found this too, but I'm always better off if I start by asking a question than by making an assertion. And so there are a couple of very specific examples I can give you. So I was looking at an application and I thought, I don't see any authorization logic anywhere. Like, how can there not be authorization in this app? And so I went and I asked the developer, like, I could have gone to the developer and said, you need to do authorization. And he would have said, the lead in this case was a guy, he would have said, it's there, you just didn't see it. At which point I'm like, oh, humbly go back, find something else to talk about. So instead I say, oh, well, how would authorization work in this kind of scenario? Where does that happen in the app? Can you help me? Oh, it's in an aspect over here. We did some of it in the controllers, we did some of it on the services, we did some of it in the persistence layer. Like, I didn't expect it to be spread all over those places, and I missed it, right? But sometimes mistakes are costly in terms of reputation. So I always find, ask a question. Sometimes you'll learn. Actually, in that case, I learned a whole way of handling security at a persistence layer that I had never really thought of doing. So I look at it as an opportunity, too. So now we're coming around to why I'm giving this talk and hopefully why you're here, right? So this summarizes kind of what the process was in a client, right? And a lot of things I'm talking about are kind of merging clients. But the highlights are, in the beginning, we started by doing a threat model, defining what our security requirements were going to be, communicating about our process, so that everybody, the business and the stakeholders knew. The business and the stakeholders are the same. The business and the developers knew. And then every sprint, we did code review and story review. And then at the end, we built operational and monitoring guides. And then we did the pen test, right? And that's the result. Right? This, to me, is still the proof in the pudding of sort of typical results and what we had for this, where we had done all these things. I do a rugged podcast with Lance and James sometimes, and it doesn't always work to bring it to clients, but it's something that gets them thinking. Sometimes it does work, sometimes it doesn't. Some organizations are ready to think about development this way, some aren't. Ultimately, like, this is how developers see security people right now. Like, this is how we want them to see us. This is how they see us. This is how we want them to see us. So, what I was trying to do in this talk is basically give you some practical, concrete examples of ways of integrating into an agile project and injecting security. We talked about this villain persona. Thankfully, I don't think there were really any of those in here, although I can't tell if you're copying, but we didn't have any hecklers. We talked about getting the baseline security requirements up front. We talked about story review, adding acceptance criteria to your stories. Getting your story points to reflect complexity. Doing things incrementally instead of all at once. Using the development team's tools. That could be continuous integration, it could be code review. Participating in the process, like stand-up. Helping them figure out how the system's going to run in the real world, and then stay involved and ask questions. I did want to thank my wife and kids. It's actually my wedding anniversary today, and I'm not home. It's terrible. So, last con, I love you. I'm absolutely eager to take questions. My favorite thing is to interact. Does anyone have questions?
I have a question for you. So as a former project manager, I know that there are issues when it comes to delivering the product. when you get into the implementation piece, and there's been numerous stats that show our percentage of projects that fail at implementation. So when do you start talking about implementation or think about it during your SLC?
Well, so what I was trying to talk about were like agile projects where you want to have at the end of every sprint something that the customer can see and feel. So like you're implementing along the way. Every week you're giving them working software. Now that's hard, but especially at the very beginning. But you want to get to where, as early as possible, people see, touch, feel the application. At least that's the kind of projects that I end up doing because that's what I like to do. And again, what the whole angle I'm trying to think about is how to get away from doing sort of checkpoint where you have to stop and evaluate security for an app at one point in time, more to like a sprinkling of pepper throughout the entree. I don't know about that. Any other questions? Yeah.
You described an almost idyllic agile environment where you actually get stories ahead of time that you can review before going into sprint planning. That's not the case for me.
Yeah.
I come into sprint planning and work put together the stories right there as part of the planning process. So it's kind of hard to go and review in advance and do things. So how do you kind of deal with something a little bit less?
Right. I'm sorry if I portrayed it as ideal because I've never actually seen an ideal agile environment. But one thing you could do is make a template of what your general acceptance criteria are going to be, so that those will get applied to almost any story. And then maybe you're even taking them out. Right. I have a list of 10 things we're going to talk about all the time, but I'll take out 7 of them because they don't apply to this one. So that makes your job easier as you're on the fly trying to define the requirements. It's kind of continuous improvement, right? Try to help them do a better job with Agile. We need to know what the stories are going to be so that we can add security into them before the developers see them. But, you're not going to win that, so you kind of have to take what you can get. The other thing is to be a little patient, right? So, like some of the case, I told an ideal story, but the reality was, even for that time-leaf example with cross-site scripting, right, it kept popping up, right? So rather than getting frustrated about it and saying, why don't you guys learn the lesson? It's sort of like, here I am, I'm just your little gentle reminder, I'm your office paperclip, whatever it is, right? I don't care what you think, I'm just going to remind you. Try to do it in a constructive way, and then, things change over time. That's another thing that's really hard is taking like a longer-term view, right? Because you see an issue and you want to fix it. But if you can take a little bit of a longer-term view, then you can fit in, because developers are already balancing a whole bunch of different stuff. The thing that's most important to you is almost certainly not the most important to them. Anyone else? Yeah?
Any suggestions for getting looped into development work earlier on? I'm in the situation where I'm constantly, hey, we're putting this live tomorrow, you should take a look at it.
I'm sorry.
Or we did it yesterday, you should go take a look at it.
Right. Well, I guess I'm sort of hoping that by telling this story, you have some ammunition of if we do it earlier, when we get to the end, we don't have all these issues. So kind of one of the things that most developers and quality folks believe is that if you find a bug more close to the time that it was introduced, it's going to be faster to fix it and cost less to fix it. Right? So if you can identify security requirements earlier, it's going to cost less to implement them than it does later, right? So that's kind of one of the arguments you could use. But part of it is just saying, hey, I'm available, and I'm going to go to a few meetings, like stand-ups, and get to know you guys, without necessarily expecting to get anything specific out of it, right? You have to kind of make yourself available, and then people will start to see you as a resource. At least that's my experience. If you go and have a lot of demands right away, they already have a lot of demands. But that doesn't necessarily apply only to security, right? That could be anything. I don't know. I'm thinking about your question. I'm not sure what else to say.
Fair enough.
You know, I have become begrudgingly a fan of policy in certain cases. So another thing you can do is talk to people about having a policy, right? Find the person who's responsible, who's actually going to be, responsible when there is a security bug in the app, and ask them, like, do you have a policy for how it's going to get handled, and can I help you build one? And can we work on a policy that's going to be a little bit more proactive? And let them tell you how to engage a little bit too. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
What else? Yeah.
Who would you recommend we vote for OWASP?
Stop.
I mean, I'm open, so.
Well, you should vote for me to be on the board.
Oh,
I'm running for the OWASP board, yes, but you're bad.
I didn't know.
You're bad. I don't want to talk about that here. That's not my intent.
Vote for Matt.
I'm going to turn red. Yeah, there's the heckler.
I got a question.
Sure.
How do you handle like the correlation between very strict password security requirements and the ease for the end user, to like recover their password, because the end user is like for like a banking system, you don't want to be hassled with all these. You don't want to have this grueling password requirements that expire every 20 days, and it's long past, and then how do you handle, having a good secure system and then on top of that, let the user have a easy experience.
Well, so, did everybody hear the question? I don't know if I could give an easy answer to that, but I do think that, it is important to actually require complicated passwords. That's not something I would necessarily write off. But ultimately, what I like to do is tell the business, like, here's some information about what happens when we don't use complicated passwords, or we let people share passwords between systems, or, right, here are some examples of breaches where passwords were dumped and then cracked. Right, that's why we need to use bcrypt. That's why we need to handle these in a better way. This is why two-factor is important. And start to explain to the business what the scenario is, and let them tell you what the requirement is. I guess part of what I'm trying to say here is that what we want to do, or what I try to do, is get the stakeholders to tell the developers how much security they need. And because I can't tell them that, I'm not a stakeholder. I'm not paying for the system. But if the business owners are saying this is a sensitive system and we need to do the right thing from a security perspective, how much does it cost? Right? You try to give them some layers, some options, with not just cost, but also what does it mean? Right? This means that somebody could actually just run a brute forcing tool and in a period of time potentially crack passwords. This means they can't. This means they have to have something. This means they have a token we give them as opposed to something that gets generated. Does that make sense? I always like to give people more options than you actually want them to choose, especially harder options than you actually want them to choose, so that a hard option looks decent. That's like negotiation. That's not security at all, right? Does that make sense?
And there's also a book called Security and Usability. It's like we had in a project that I worked on, we had the usability folks fight with the security folks to be, they kind of naturally conflict. And that book was good from both perspectives because it talked about things from a usability perspective and from a security perspective. So in terms of the password thing, the one thing that everybody kind of agreed on in the end was, passwords shouldn't be complicated, but we can use sentences as opposed to, some crazy thing that you have to remember.
Right. One of the things that I've seen also used is combining that concept is like a meter that shows you how hard the password would be to guess, right? And so those are a little bit arbitrary, right? But at least the user knows how complicated their password is. But actually, your point is really good because it's not just with this kind of workflow. A lot of times, usability and security are kind of seem to be conflicting. And usability itself is so hard, right? Think about Apple products, right? It's they're so simple, but the fact is it took tons of energy to make them simple, right? You had to say all these things you weren't going to do. Well, the ideal is to get to where security is also just like baked in and no user sees it. Right? It's very easy to expose administration on everything in an app instead of focusing in on specifically what this user role needs. Does that make sense? And so sometimes that work to make it more usable is really hard, but actually improves security too. They're not always not aligned.
The last speaker said that passwords eventually probably didn't go away.
I've heard that too. I've seen.
What's the alternative?
Well, there's sort of like heuristic data about like based on how fast you type and where you're coming from and what we can fingerprint on your browser. I mean, that's all not my area of expertise, honestly. But if you're interested, you could look at. I collaborate with Aaron Bedra a little bit, who's based in Chicago, and he works on a tool called RepSheet, which is open source. And it does that kind of behavior-based throttling and letting people in or not into the system. So that might be something to look at. Thank you very much. If you have questions, feel free to grab me after.
Thank you, Matt.
Appreciate it.
All right, everybody.